Hello, cruel world. A black schoolgirl was strip searched recently by the Metropolitan Police while she was on a period because she was wrongly suspected of carrying cannabis. So this happened in the girls' school, which was in East London around the end of 2020, but it's been in the news very recently because it's all come to light. And this search was done without an adult present, and a safeguarding report which led from this said that racism was a likely influencing factor. So in this brief episode, I'm going to tell you the background details of that case. I'm going to explore the topic of racism within police work. I'm going to explain what is adultification, and I'm going to talk about the Macpherson Report. So some of you would have known about this. It suggested there was institutionalised racism in the police. It was a report in February 1999, and it came off the back of a tragic case of Stephen Lawrence being murdered, which occurred in April 1993. So I'm going to talk about what's changed 23 years later, if anything, down the line. Let's get started. Welcome to A Psych for Sore Minds. Right, let's talk about this, the case of this black schoolgirl first of all. I'll tell you some background. So the police officers arrived at school because one of the school teachers apparently smelt cannabis and was concerned about this young woman. So then this schoolgirl, remember she was only a schoolgirl, was strip searched by two female officers whilst the teacher waited outside. And reportedly some of her intimate body parts were exposed, and she was even asked to take out her sanitary towel. No drugs were found, and she was sent home in a taxi. So various reports have said that this is a classic case of adultification. So what is that? What is adultification? I have to admit it's a new terminology for me. It's when a child is perceived to be older than they actually are. And the problem is that when they're perceived this way, they're not given the care and protection and support that minors should get. In fact, some studies have shown that black girls in particular are often viewed as more adult-like, and they're perceived as more mature, more kind of sexually experienced and less innocent. So why am I telling you all this? What does it matter? Well, it leads to criminalisation, it leads to harsher sentences from judges, and it leads to higher punishment rates in school. And critically, and most importantly, which you could argue in this case of this schoolgirl, it leads to a critical lack of safeguarding. So in my professional work for the NHS, I carry out assessments on mentally disordered offenders, and I've heard stories of young men being taken off and being pressurised to go into gangs. And I've got a question whether the young black men is kind of seen as more acceptable because they're seen as being more sort of streetwise, more criminalistic, more involved in gangs, and they look older compared to whiter peers who are thought of as being more innocent, even if they're the same age. There's a perception amongst some professionals that they need more protection. So this is something that I've seen myself. It's something that's reported by black children, and basically, I suppose in my opinion is what I'm saying is that it's dehumanizing for the actual children involved. And at the heart of it, what it boils down to, basically, if you take away all the fancy terminology, is that black children are perceived as not deserving to be victims. So all of this, talking about this, reminds me of the case of Rocky Bennett. It's a tragic case of a black Afro-Caribbean man who was detained in a medium secure psychiatric unit, like exactly the kind of place that I work in. And he was restrained by nursing staff, and he was actually tragically killed. This happened in 1998, I believe. I've done an entire deep dive video on my channel about this if you're interested in this kind of case. Absolutely tragic case. And also one of the findings was institutionalised racism. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is that these patterns here that keep recurring, aren't there? Okay. So let's move on. I mentioned the Macpherson Report, and I want to talk about what's going on 23 years later. So I'm sure most of you listening to this, unless you're very young, will know that Stephen Lawrence was a young man who was brutally and senselessly murdered. This occurred on the 22nd of April, 1993. It was a completely unprovoked racist attack in South London. So there was an inquiry following that by Sir William Macpherson, hence the Macpherson Report. And he found major failings in the police investigation. And he published this report, which was 23 years ago, more than 23 years ago, in February 1999. And at the time, it was thought to be groundbreaking because it led to major changes in the law, it led to changes in policing, there was supposed to be a response to institutional racism and the treatment of racist crimes. And also it's thought that 2 convictions for Stephen Lawrence's murder came directly from that investigation. So in that inquiry, 70 recommendations were made. What I'm about to talk about, what I think is interesting, is that parliament.co.uk released a report. It's actually a year old now, so even though now it's 23 years later, the time of the report was last year, so it's 22 years later. And I'll put links in the descriptions for that report if you want to read it yourself. But I will summarise it for you now. So the areas that were covered were things like community confidence from BAME. So you probably know BAME stands for Black, Asian and Minority Ethnic People. So it's about their confidence in the police force, how police tackle racist crimes, and how there's recruitment and retention of BAME police officers. And also, crucially, I think, the racial disparity in terms of stop and search and other police powers. So this report, this investigation by Parliament last year said that since the Macpherson Report, there have been some improvements in policing. So particularly in the way of policing and documenting racist crimes and of attempts to promote equality and diversity. But surprise, surprise, I don't think this is going to shock anybody. Overall, there's been far more failings. So persistent, deep-rooted and unjustifiable racial disparities still exist in key areas. There's still significant problems with confidence within the police, within black communities, particularly young men, black men. So to give you a specific example, about 67% of white adults believe that the police will treat them fairly, compared to 56% of black adults. I mean, those are pretty poor numbers, to be honest, even with the white adults. That's, even with the privileged group, they're saying that 1 in 3 don't think they'll be treated fairly by the police. I mean, to me, that's pretty shocking. Okay, dear viewers, I have a question for you. In the year leading up to March 2020, black people were stopped and searched how many times more often than white people in England? What is your best guess? Let me know your educated best answer. I'll reveal the answer later on in this episode. Okay, so going back to this revision report, racial hatred remains a severe problem in society. There were over 75,000 race-related incidents in England and Wales in the year 2019 to 2020. And it was also felt that some black men and women, when they reported hate crimes, they were treated as suspects rather than as victims. There's also this feeling that the government and police forces are kind of being outsmarted or left behind by a rise of online racism and online racist crimes. As a side note, if you're interested, I've done a video on the psychology behind internet trolling, as well as a real life case of a tragic case of a 14-year-old girl who was pushed to suicide by bullies, and then even her family were bullied after that. But I do a deep dive on the psychological processes from the perspective of a psychiatrist such as myself into bullying and internet trolling. So this report said that they needed the Home Office and the NPCC strategies for policing hate crime because online, because they're really lacking when it comes to that specific area. Okay, the Macpherson Report also recommended that the police should be representative of the communities that they serve. So a 10-year target was set by the then Home Secretary, which was that the overall ethnic minority proportion in police services should be 7%. So that was supposed to have been met by 2009, and surprise, surprise, it wasn't. Even by 2020, it had only just been met. So only 7% of officers in 2020 were from BAME backgrounds and origins in the police force in England and Wales, even though the population is about 14%. And I think, very importantly, there was particularly underrepresentation for more senior ranks. So only around 4% of officers at or above the rank of Chief Inspector came from BAME backgrounds. In terms of police misconduct and discipline, there was also a clear racial disparity in the number of officers being dismissed from the police forces. So BAME officers are more than twice as likely to be dismissed as their white counterparts. And I've saved the biggest bugbear till last, so probably in my opinion at least, one of the major issues is stop and search. So dear viewers, I asked you before in the year leading up to 31st of March 2020, how many times more often were black people stopped in stop and search than white people? And the answer is 9.5 times more likely. I mean, to me, that is just absolutely mind-blowing. So despite the serious concerns in the Macpherson Report, in summary, what I would say is that there are still major problems. In fact, to be specific, the disproportionality in stop and search is greater now at this point in time than it was 22 years ago when the Macpherson Report still was being published. And the Parliament.uk said that stop and search is an important tool to prevent crimes, but there's no evidence or there's no justification to explain why there's such a big disparity. And finally, my last point is that searches for the possession of drugs shows that black people are less likely than white people to have used drugs in the last year, but are 2.4 times more likely to be stopped for drug busts. And there are many examples, anecdotal examples, of black people saying that the stop and searches were done in a very sort of alienating, aggressive kind of manner. And just as another kind of statistical example, in the first lockdown, black people were 1.8 times more likely to be subject to COVID enforcement measures than white people. So to summarize all of these things, in conclusion, it's just showing a strong pattern of discrimination against black people and other ethnic minorities from the police sources. So what were the recommendations from this updated report? They recommended that the Equality and Human Rights Commission undertakes works to determine a framework which is kind of used as a standard for police forces to be rigorously assessed by. Okay, so that's a lot of rambling. I've got questions for you, dear viewers, and they're pretty difficult questions, but I'd like to know in the Schmoment section below. What is the answer? So the problem has been identified. The problem has been pretty overt and has been clear for over 23 years. What is the solution? Is it more funding? Is it positive discrimination? Is it something that ethnic communities have to take some burden or responsibility themselves? And if so, what do they do? So please let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. Okay, just as a very late introduction, my name is Dr. Shaham Das. I'm a consultant forensic psychiatrist. So I assess mentally disordered offenders for a living in courts and prisons, psychiatric units. You can call me the ominous Shahaminous. I've got loads of videos on this channel, Psych for Soul Mind, which dissect the crossover between true crime and mental illness. My videos are very much like my children. I definitely have my favorites. So I've listed a few of them in the Schmoment section below. Go and check them out. Give you a very quick example. I've done deep dives on the psychology behind stalking, psychology behind internet trolling, as I mentioned before, behind domestic violence. So I take a deep dive into characteristic traits, personality traits, and I give case examples every single time. I've also done a recent video on the difference between organised and disorganised serial killers, if that floats your boat. All right, go check out my other videos, go buy my book, it's dope. And if you want to know more about that report I was talking about, the link will be in the Schmoment section below. Have a blessed day, stay euthymic, and do not forget, I love you.